Hi everyone, I'm Aneka from Made to Sew. In this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to sew a contour dart. Now a contour dart is also referred to as a double-ended dart because it has 2 points, one at either end and no gap in the middle. Some people also call it a fish-eye dart, or I've heard it called that in the past. Now in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you step by step how I personally sew one, and also the standard sort of dressmaking method so that you've got two options to choose from. If you're more interested in what a contour dart is, when you would have it in a garment and why it's there, then please watch my What Is tutorial and I'll cover that in a little bit more detail. So without further ado, grab the pattern that you're working with and we can begin. So obviously you're going to want to start by cutting out the garment that you are working with in the fabric that you're working with. Now, once you have cut out your fabric, you are going to want to mark the details of the contour dart onto the wrong side of the fabric. Now, I personally use carbon paper most of the time, dressmakers carbon paper or a form of carbon paper, and hopefully you can see this marked onto the wrong side of my fabric. Now, this is the carbon paper that I often use. It's called Saral and it comes on a huge roll. I believe you can buy it in A4 sheets as well. And I will use this and a tracing wheel to mark the details. Now, I won't do this if my fabric is delicate, perhaps the tracing wheel would damage it, or even if I was worried that the carbon paper wouldn't come off, perhaps it was going to be dry cleaned. If I had a white garment, I would always use white paper. So in those circumstances, I would go back to tailor's tacks and I would tailor's tack the top points and the middle points of my contour dart. Or you could also thread trace the lines on both sides. It's totally up to you. I'm not going to be covering what I did here in this tutorial, because I do have a tutorial where I show you how to use carbon paper, how to do tailor's tacks and how to do thread tracing. I will link to those here. So hopefully you can now take a closer look at the lines that I have drawn on with the carbon paper. You will also see that I've got a horizontal line at the top and the bottom of the dart, and I often use this partly for when people are learning to sew darts, but it just gives you a really clear idea of where the dart ends. You must finish sewing the fabric at that point and at that point. So it is a good idea to do that when you're learning. Just check that it doesn't mark the right side of the fabric when you do so. Now, when it comes to contour darts, I'm going to be showing you two methods for sewing them. The first method is to simply sew on and all the way through and off. Now, I will be honest with you, that is the method that I use most of the time. That's because I can sew this accurately. I've been sewing for a number of years and I'm happy with what I'm doing. However, if you are a beginner, I would recommend what is often taught in dressmaking, which is to start in the center, sew off, so you've completed one half, and then you would start back in the center and to sew off the other half. It does make it easier. So I'm therefore going to be pinning it with that in mind. We're going to be pinning it with the method of starting in the middle, sewing off, starting on this side and sewing off, and then I will show you my technique afterwards. So when it comes to pinning, decide on which half you're going to be doing first, and when I pin my darts, I always think about how they go through the sewing machine. I'll always, or pretty much always, start by pinching the point of the dart and grabbing a pin and positioning that in. Now, what I mean by thinking about the way it goes through the sewing machine, I want to sew my dart with the bulk of my fabric on the left, because the right hand side is always the smaller area of the machine. I personally go by the method of what is called pin basting. So I'm pinning on the line that I'm planning on sewing, so this dotted line. And I do that for accuracy. It holds the dotted lines on both sides together, and it means that you're going to be sewing them together. But you can obviously do the method that you would like and that you feel comfortable with. So back to pinning the first side. So I've pinned the point, and then I'll generally pin the middle area. So at the middle here, I'll go from the dotted line on one side through to the dotted line on the other side. Now you can see here that the pin hasn't quite got the dotted line on the underside. So all I will do now is to take the one side of fabric off, and I've just got the pin on this side here, and then I will position it back on. making sure that I've got the two sides, just like so. And then I can continue pinning up this side. So I'm going to be sewing this side first, from the middle up to the point and off the fabric. Make sure that you are always being accurate and getting those two lines on top of one another if you're following my technique of pin basting. Now, if you haven't marked your darts with carbon paper or thread tracing, you would simply be matching a tailor stack in the middle and a tailor stack at the end. And that's how you would be pinning everything in place. But you won't have a line to sew along. You would simply start in the middle and aim for your point, which is great if you're advanced and you know what you're doing. But if you're a beginner, I would suggest grabbing a ruler and a pen of chalk or removable pen and just drawing that line on, connecting the two. I just think it'll be easier to have a line to follow along with when you're sewing. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine. We're going to start in the middle. You can do a back stitch here. If you don't backstitch, remember that you're going to need to backstitch and sew over yourself when you sew the other side. We're going to continue along the drawn line and we're going to remove the pins as we go, coming to the end where I have got that horizontal marking with my carbon paper. And if you haven't got one of these, you could draw it on now with some chalk or a removable pen. It's just sometimes quite useful to have an end point. You know, you must be off the fabric after that point. That's the end of the dart. So I'm going to begin sewing at the middle point of the dart for this method. You can backstitch here or you can simply start sewing and obviously sew over yourself and backstitch when you complete the other side. I'm working my way along, stitching on the line. So I'm feeding the line right into my needle and the center of my presser foot. I'm going to take the pins out as I go because obviously I don't want to upset my machine. And the good thing about pin basting is that if you're working with a tricky fabric, you can take these pins out ever so slowly as you sew towards them. So you can really take them out at the last minute. Now, I'm coming up to the end point here. That is this horizontal line that I've marked onto my fabric. Now, to get a really professional finish to the top of the dart, you want to ideally stitch the last couple of stitches right on the edge of this fold, and then you will leave the fabric. So we really want to stitch the last couple of stitches right on the edge, so it's all very smooth, there's no harsh angles here, and then I'm off the fabric. So then rather than backstitching or cutting my threads here, I'll lift the foot and I will pull that away to leave nice long tails. So I have stitched from the middle to the point of my contour dart, and I've got some nice threads that I'm going to be showing you how to tie in a minute. Now we're going to stitch the other side. So to do that, we need to turn the fabric over because we want to start in the middle and sew to the point with the majority of the fabric on the left, the head of the pin facing us, so it's easy to pull out. Just like we did before, we're going to pinch the point to start, pin in the middle, and then connect the pins, making sure that you go from one dotted line to the other dotted line. Then you can join me at the sewing machine and I will show you how we're going to sew this. Now I'm going to be sewing the second side of my contour dart. So if I lift my presser foot up here, hopefully you can see that I've gone in on the stitching from the first side. And I'm going to need to backstitch here to secure it because I didn't backstitch for my first side. Either way, you want to make sure obviously that your stitching meets. So on both sides, your stitching meets or you stitch over yourself in the middle. So I'll do a couple of back stitches there. And then I'm going to be stitching along just like I did for the first side. I'm going to be following the line, taking my pins out as I go all the way to the end. And then I'm going to be sewing off at that point, aiming to have 2 to 3 stitches right on the edge of the fabric at the end. So as you can see, this is the first side. I have sewn now the top and the bottom of the contour dart, and I'm going to show you how to finish your threads in a second. But before I finish my threads, I will pretty much always sew my next dart because on the body you'll probably always have 2 of the same dart. This is my front contour dart, and I've got another front one on the opposite side. So what I like to do now is to compare them. So I will grab my next dart and I will start pinning this one. And what I want to be comparing is the length, because you may find that you have gone 1 or 2 stitches too much or too little on these points. And if it's only 1 or 2 stitches, then you can make that amendment to the next dart that you're about to sew, which will mean that they are then the same length. So let me pin this one ready to go, and I will show you what I mean. So what I'll do here is line them up one on top of each other, and I will see, right, where does the first one finish? Okay, let me grab my chalk pen, and I will put my horizontal line that we did before at the place where the first one I've sewn finishes. And I'll do the same on the bottom. And it just means that then I'm really accurate when I take this to the machine and I get my second dart the same as my first dart. Now, please don't confuse this with the darts on the front of the body being the same as on the back of the body, because they might not be. But the 2 front darts should be the same length and the 2 back darts should be the same length. Now I'm going to take you to the machine and I'm going to show you how I sew this second dart. We're going to be sewing onto the dart, along the stitching line and off. Now, this is the method that I generally use, but I would suggest, if you are a beginner, that you stick with this method because it's easier to get accurate results. I'm not going to backstitch with either method here, but I will tell you that there are times that I do backstitch my darts, and I would just suggest, if you want to backstitch your darts, that you need to make sure you're accurate. You want to have 1 to 2 stitches of backstitching as a maximum, because you don't want to be adding any bulk to the points. If the fabric's too lightweight, don't backstitch, it will just pull the fabric up and it will look really puckered and messy. And when you are backstitching, you must remember to backstitch exactly on top of your stitching line or almost inside of it, so that you're not adding any more bulk to that area. So it's just a little tip if you find yourself wanting to backstitch. Otherwise, I'm going to be showing you how to tie off these threads in a second. So I'm ready to go just before the edge of my fabric. I plan to stitch a couple of stitches right on the edge of that fold of fabric before I start following the drawn line. So here goes. And I'm not going to backstitch on this one, I'm just going to stitch on and go for it. And then I'm following my drawn line and I'm taking my pins out as I go. Nice and easy now. All the way around until you get to the other ends. And then when I get to the other end, it's just like what we did before. We're going to be sewing off the fabric. Again, trying to have 2 to 3 stitches right on the folded edge of the fabric. And obviously keeping to those lines that we've drawn. And there you have the 2 darts that I have sewn. So we need to finish the threads now. So the threads in the middle of this one, they can obviously be trimmed because you've backstitched that area. And then all of the rest of the end threads need to be knotted. So I will show you how to do that. One thing I didn't mention with this dart is that if you want to, before you do sew it on the machine, you're more than welcome to tack or baste it, especially if you're working with a tricky fabric. To knot the threads, I would separate them and then tie them through once and then twice. Don't pull your knots so tight that they pull on the thread and cause any puckering. Complete it a couple of times, 2 to 3 times will be enough. And then you can either leave it if you think it's nice and secure and cut it off about, say, 1/2 inch, 1 centimetre away from the knot. Or if you are worried about the knots coming undone, perhaps it's a dart that's going to take quite a lot of strain, you can thread the 2 threads through the eye of a needle and then simply run that back up your stitching. Either up the stitching or very close to the stitching on the inside of it. You don't obviously want to be sewing this on the main bit of the fabric. Just like so. And then once you've done that, you can cut that away and you're done. You can do that obviously to all of the dart ends that you need to. And then we're going to take a look at pressing. And now it's time to press your contour dart. I always generally start by pressing my darts flat, just to help everything sit nicely, or the stitches to sit nicely in the fabric. Use a little bit of steam. Whenever you're working with darts, you always want to use a ham or a rolled up towel. This would allow you to get really into the point of the dart and get a nice finish at the point so that you don't have any puckering or any pleats here. Now, when it comes to a contour dart that are vertical in the body, you're going to want to make a decision as to whether you want to press them towards the centre or the side. This is going to depend on your personal opinion. Generally, darts that are vertical will get pressed into the centre, or that's generally what's discussed in sort of dressmaking patterns and things. However, I have always preferred to press my darts towards my side seam. I feel that it looks a little bit nicer on the garment. The majority of us have more bulk in the centre, so we don't want to be adding to that bulk. We want to be pushing them towards the side and getting a nice finish. All I will say here is try both and see what looks good on you, because that's what it's all about. It's about your shape and how it looks on your body. You will find by pressing the darts in one direction or the other that you get a shadow in a different direction, and so it will look different from the outside of the garment. Now, when it comes to contour darts or double-ended darts, you've got a couple of options with pressing. And it does depend on how bulky the dart is and the fabric that you're working with. If it isn't a very bulky dart, you may find that you can press it in the direction that you want and it will stay flat. I might be able to get away with it with this one. And the key to pressing darts is to really press into the point. Put that on the curve of the ham and give a nice little steam in that point there. And you'll need to do that on both ends with a contour dart. Now, this dart might just lay flat like it is. However, I'm going to show you two techniques that you can use to help it. The first one is to use your scissors to cut straight in at the waist here. This is going to release the fabric. So I've just cut through the dart. I haven't cut through anything else. And it will just allow the dart to release slightly because the straight line of the fabric or the fold of the fabric is going to be a smaller circumference than that curved line that you've just sewn. So to release it, a little clip like that works well. And then you would continue pressing. Another option with your scissors is actually to trim some of the dart bulk away. Obviously, it does depend on how large this dart is, but trimming it to sort of 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 from the stitching line. So that's 5 millimeters to 1 centimeter from the stitching line. You won't need to necessarily do it all the way along, but just by trimming out that middle section, it will allow it to sit better. You then have the option to press this in the direction of your choosing, or even to press this open if you wanted to. And you could work your way along, pressing this open. Now, the methods that you use really depends on the fabric that you're working with, the dart size, and also what you want to achieve, your shape as well in terms of pressing direction. They're just things to consider and ideas for you to work with. Also consider how you're going to finish the inside of the garment. Are you going to add a lining? So does it matter that you have snipped or cut away your dart? Just consider these options. Thank you so much for watching the tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed the technique of how to sew a contour dart and that you feel more confident sewing these darts in the future. Thanks for watching and see you soon.